Hi everyone, here we are hitting week 4. And in week 4, we're going to start to define what the project is. And like the previous weeks, when we get into class, we're going to relate this to our real life client that I'm working with and kind of put some of these concepts to work. So make sure that you have done your reading and understand. And I'm going to highlight really in a 10-minute or less here, like I always do, what are, I think, the key and critical concepts that you need to understand. So we are here defining the project. We're going to define project scope and what's involved with it. We're going to establish project priorities. We're going to create a work breakdown structure, and I am going to ask you to make sure that you've done your reading on that and you understand the concept of how to put one of those together. We're going to talk about process breakdown structure, responsibility matrix, and project communication plans, all of which are really needed to be set up in the beginning. Again, we're kind of in that planning phase of our project to make sure that when we move forward with the implementation, that we're ready to go and we have an idea of what's going on. So 5 general steps for collecting project information. We define the project scope, and as we move on here, we'll talk about what's involved in project scope. I am a big proponent of ensuring you understand the scope of your project, ensuring all the stakeholders understand the scope, and that it's not just what's in the project, it's also what you won't be doing in the project. Establishing project priorities, creating the work breakdown structure so we understand how things are going to happen, integrating that within the organization and assigning to people, and coding it for the information system. So project to scope defined, is the definition of the end result or mission of your project, a product or service for your client. It defines the results being achieved, specific, tangible, measurable terms. So we want to say that we are going to, in the case of, let's say, implementing a marketing plan, that we will implement a marketing plan that is social media based. It will include things such as Facebook and Instagram, but we will not be including Twitter. Maybe you're putting the plan together, but you're not actually going to be the ones that are implementing it per se, in terms of you will provide all the data, you will provide all the posts, and then they'll be released by the company. So you would really make sure your scope is clearly defined in terms of what the deliverables are you're going to give to the end user. You're going to focus on the project purpose, and it's to be published and used by the project owner and project participants for the planning and measuring of it. So this is how we're going to kind of then start to break down what's going on with the project. Okay, so your project scope checklist. We want to know what the objective of the project is. We want to know what the product scope description is. So what is the scope of what's being created? What's the justification for what we're doing? So why are we doing it? What deliverables will be involved? So deliverables are going to be tangible things that you do along the way. What are the milestones? And milestones are usually the points, like we talked about last week a little bit about kill points. So they're going to be points through the project that you're going to go through, and you're going to assess where the progress is and show people what you're doing and make sure you are where you are. When we get more into estimating and things and we get into cost, this is probably where you're going to take a review of things and show people what's going on. We're going to talk about the technical requirements of the project. Limits and exclusions. So as I said, it's not just what's in, it's what's out, and acceptance criteria. So what is acceptance criteria? This means when we get to the end that the project is going to be accepted as complete by the client. So if it was a product, this is what has to be done in order for them to say, yes, you are finished and you can, close out the project to be done. Project scope, terms and definitions. So scope statement is a short 1 or 2 page summary of the key elements of scope, followed by an extended documentation of each element. This is also referred to as a statement of work. So a lot of the times, because I come from a purchasing background, when we would scope out what somebody was going to do for us, we would give them the statement of work, and then they would quote out that work. And that would be what would be expected of them when we sign the contract. The project charter is a document that authorizes the project manager to initiate and lead the project, and it includes the scope as well as risk limits, the business case, spending limits, and even team composition, so that the project managers going in know what framework they're working in. And then we talk scope creep. So scope creep is really big because people often want more than they initially asked for. As you go through, there'll be these ideas or thoughts that come along, and we have to understand that when we change the requirements, specifications, or priorities, that something has to give within the project. So 5 of the most common causes of scope creep. poor requirement analysis. So do we actually know what we're required to do, or do things come up along the way? This is why so much of your project is related to having solid planning done. Not involving users early enough. So we need to really identify those stakeholders in the project planning phase, so that we make sure everyone who's going to be involved, who's going to be a user, has discussed with us what they want, so we know what we can and can't do. And maybe some of those things are things that we can't do, but then our scope is also going to include that, so we don't get creeped down the way. Running a lot of projects through Capstone, a lot of the times the clients, as things go along, will go, oh, well, it would be really nice if we had X, Y, Z. The problem when you get to fourth year and you're doing Capstone is it is a 12-week process in one semester with limited financial resources. So when those people say it would be nice, but if we do X, we have to give up Y. So again, one of the ways that we can deal with scope creep is making sure they understand that there's going to be gives and takes. I know I said to you, it's important to be agile and adjust, and it is, but what we're going to get to in the end or in the period of time that we're expecting is going to be different, and they need to understand that. Understanding the project complexity. Maybe we don't really understand how hard it is to do what we're doing, and that could be based on the organization, their level of engagement in the project, or just in terms of how technical the project is, might be higher than what they are currently able to complete or do. So now we need to have extra resources to train people, to put manuals together, or to simplify processes maybe and give short keys. Lack of change control. So change control will come up further, I think, as we read along, but change control is really an authority that allows you to make these changes to the project. So we might be in an agile mindset and do things, but that needs to be reviewed by somebody to say, yes, we can move forward with this change, or no, it doesn't make sense, it needs to stay the way it is, which is sometimes nice for a project manager because it takes the burden of being the no person all the time kind of off of them and puts it to committee. And then last but not least, gold plating. And gold plating is really kind of adding features that, while nice to have, are not things that the people would necessarily pay for or were expecting to have, but you do this and you're like, oh, it would be really nice for them if the user interface looked like X. And yes, it's really nice to have that nice user interface, but if the product has all the needs built within it, it's just a nice to have. And we do those things, but we're not getting paid extra for them, and they're not really adding that much extra value. So we have to think about what we're doing along the way. Step 2, establishing project priorities. So now we've got 3 major criteria, the trade-offs that the project manager has to make. So we have to really have what's called the iron triangle, right? We have to look at time, cost, and performance. And how are we going to balance those things to meet the needs of the project? The project manager can manage project trade-offs by completing a priority matrix for the project and identify the criteria. So constrain, is it an original parameter that is fixed? Enhance, is it a criteria that will be optimizing things? Or accept, a criteria that is tolerable, not to meet the original specs. So we can kind of move and adjust, but we're going to try and stay within our confines. So here's this triangle we talked about. Project priority matrix for the development of a new wireless router is what they did here. So here's where the priorities are on things that can and can't move in terms of time, performance, and cost. Creating a work breakdown structure. So as I said, I want to make sure that you have gone through the book and understand how to build one. So you're starting at the high level and working down until you get down to the work packages, which can be assigned to the team members. It's a hierarchical outline of the project at the different levels of detail. It identifies the products and work elements involved, and it defines the relationship between the final deliverable of the project and its sub-deliverables. So really, here's what we're doing, and here's how we're breaking it into pieces. And it kind of is like a triangular shape usually. There's a lot of softwares that you can use for this to build it up and to have it more aesthetically pleasing, but it can simply be done in something like Microsoft Excel or PowerPoint, and there's lots of templates out there. It really serves as the framework for tracking cost and work performance, and it's best suited for design and build projects that have tangible outcomes rather than process-oriented projects. So here is an example of a work breakdown structure, and we have the major tangible deliverables, and then you're breaking them into smaller deliverables and smaller pieces down to your sub deliverables, and then the final work breakdown packages. So what is a work breakdown or work package? It's the lowest level of WBS. It's a short duration task. And these are the things that are like easily manageable and quantifiable. So they have a defined start and end point that consumes resources and represents cost. Should not exceed 10 working days or 1 reporting period. So you're trying to keep them so that at the end of each period, yes, we're checking that off and we move on to the next task. They should be independent of other work packages for the project as possible, and the basic unit used for planning, scheduling, and controlling the project. So we're going to have our work breakdown projects, and that's how we're going to know what's going on. So each work package in the WBS defines work, identifies the time needed to complete it, identifies the phased budget to complete the work package, so to make sure that we're on track as long as we go along the way, because we don't want to spend all the money up front and then realize we're short at the end, identifies resources needed to complete it, so how much resource, identifies the single person responsible for it, so who is responsible for making sure that that piece is completed, what department are they in, assigning a person, and then identifies monitoring points for measuring progress. So how well are we getting to the end of the things? So integrating the work breakdown structure into the organization. We have our organizational work breakdown structure. It depicts how the firm's organization will discharge these work packages, provides a framework to summarize organizational unit work performance, identifies the organization's unit's responsibility for them, and ties it to cost control accounts. So now we know where the money is coming from for each of these different activities. The intersection of the work packages and this organization unit create a project cost point or cost account that integrates work and responsibility. So now we're starting to get a plan on how we're going to do things. So here we go, integration of the work breakdown structure in OBS. So now you can see down at the bottom here, as we move along, we're breaking it down into the organization of who's going to be responsible for those things and where the cost account is that's associated with them. So step 5, coding the WBS. So now we're coding it into levels, and you're going to have it break down, and you're going to have level 1s, and then you're going to have 1.1s that are pieces of those, and 1.11s that are pieces of those until you get into these small pieces. So the next slide, we'll talk about responsibility matrix. It's also a linear responsibility chart. It summarizes the tasks to be accomplished and who's responsible for them. So again, we're getting further and further down in terms of who's responsible. So the next slide shows you a little responsibility matrix. And you'll see these a lot in any kind of project you work on. I would have these at work all the time. So who's responsible for making sure things happen? Who's responsible for supporting that function or assists with it? But really, it helps to define accountability and make sure things are happening, because you know who you're going back to when different projects or different components of those projects need done. Here's another example: responsible, support, consult, notify, approval. So some of your stakeholders are going to be involved in here depending on what their role is they play along the way. So if we look at this architectural design is a 1, so they're responsible. Development is a 2, they're going to support. Testing is a 2, they're also going to support, because probably once it's designed, the testing is going to make sure it actually works. And then quality assurance is going to be consulted to make sure it meets all the standards, depending on what industry you're in. You might have ISO standards, you might have automotive standards, you can have standards for IT, you can have standards for aerospace. So it really depends on what industry you're working within. And then last but not least, in here, they're consulting manufacturing. So it's really nice that you design something, guys, but can we actually build it? And this happens a lot of the time. It gets down to manufacturing, and they're like, that design doesn't work for what we can build. So you have to go back to the drawing board. So this is why something like this exists, and you will consult people to make sure the design that you've created is actually manufacturable. And you can have engineers in all these different roles that understand the same languages and can talk to each other. We would have a lot of things in aerospace where we would stress test, and so we would have stress engineers that would work with manufacturing to say, this can be done this way. If you do it this way, it will meet the requirements that need to be in space. It's all dependent kind of on the type of materials you're using. But in this case, they're talking specifics about architectural design on some hardware. So project communication plan, again, if there's one thing that I will say is important to you, probably in any aspect of business, it's being able to communicate and being able to communicate effectively. So understanding who to communicate to, when, and at what level. And that's really what the communication plan is about. Project communication plans address the following questions. What information needs to be collected and when? Who will receive the information? The method that will be used. So some people just want an email update. Others may want a slide presentation. Some may say, you know what, once a week I want to have a sit-down meeting and you go over so that it's kind of a show and tell of what's going on and they can ask their questions. What are the limits, if any, on who has access to certain kind of information? So there may be projects you're doing where the information is confidential and you're doing it for an outside party and they tell you who's involved and who's not, and maybe people have conflicting viewpoints on what's going on, so you're keeping certain information safe and protected from those things. When will information be communicated? So how often, again, what day of the week, and how will it be communicated, following again those methods. Steps for developing a communication plan. So stakeholder analysis, identify your target groups, information needs, project status reports, deliverable issues, changes in scope, all those things would be identified, and then who in the stakeholders really wants to know that information and how are you going to provide the information to them. So stakeholder communication, this figure here, you're kind of talking about the different people involved and what their level is of what they want to know based on their power and their interest in the organization and how you're going to manage that. So people that are of high power to the project and have high interest, we're going to manage closely, but maybe they're of low power and have low interest in the project, so you might provide general information. So they might get a CC once a month on what's going on, but not invited to the detailed meetings about it. Here's an example of a communication plan. I apologize, it doesn't look great on the blue, but it shows what information is to be communicated, who the audience is going to be, when we're going to do it, the method we're going to use, and the provider, so who's going to do it. So here's kind of some key terms that we've gone over in this project, and that is the end of this chapter.